Have you ever considered that the more money you spend on a fish finder, the more blind you actually become to the most aggressive fish in the lake? It sounds completely crazy, right? You drop $2,000 on a massive screen, you expect it to show you absolutely everything in the water column. But today, I'm going to tell you the uncomfortable truth that marine electronics companies really do not want to advertise. Your expensive fish finder is likely ignoring the exact depth where the most active fish are feeding right now. We are going to dive deep into the blind spots, the default settings, and the physical illusions that are hiding the biggest fish from your screen. By the end of this video, you will understand exactly why you are getting skunked while staring at a perfect picture, and how to fix it immediately. Tell me right now in the comments, do you trust your gut feeling on the water, or do you refuse to cast unless you see a fish on your screen? Let us get into it. For the last 10 years, the fishing industry has undergone a massive technological revolution. We have gone from simple flashers to high-definition, live scanning, side imaging supercomputers mounted right on our dashboards. Because of this, an entire generation of fishermen has developed a deeply ingrained habit. We idle around for hours, staring straight down at a glowing rectangle, waiting for the machine to give us permission to cast. We believe that if the screen is empty, the water is absolutely empty. We trust the pixels more than we trust our own knowledge of the lake. Guys will drive right past perfect structure, amazing current breaks, and beautiful weed lines simply because the machine did not draw a nice little red arch on the screen. It is a habit that is incredibly hard to break because we have done it for years. We have convinced ourselves that technology cannot lie. But the reality is that Sonar has physical limitations, and our reliance on default settings is creating massive blind spots in the very places where fish are most active. Picture this scenario. You wake up before the sun even thinks about rising. The air is crisp, the coffee is hot, and you are backing your boat into the perfectly calm water of your favorite lake. You sit down at the console and power up that massive, brilliant screen. You spent over $2,000 on this piece of technology. It is the latest model, packed with side scanning, down imaging, and all the bells and whistles the pros talk about on television. You idle out into the main channel, watching the screen light up with vibrant colors. It feels like you have a superpower. You can see the bottom, you can see the brush piles, and you can see a few little arches that tell you fish are down there. But an hour goes by, then 2 hours go by. You have thrown every lure in your tackle box at those marks on the screen. Nothing happens, not a single bite. Meanwhile, you look over at a guy in an old aluminium boat, 100 yards away. He does not even have a screen on his dash. He is just casting, and he is pulling in fish after fish. You sit there staring at your expensive electronics, wondering if the machine is broken, or if you just lost your touch. But what if I told you the machine is working exactly as it was designed to? What if the problem is not the fish finder, but a massive blind spot that it creates? Your unit is likely ignoring the exact depth where the most active, hungry fish are feeding right now. Let us talk about the cone angle myth. Most fishermen believe that the signal shooting out of the bottom of their boat is like a massive searchlight that illuminates everything directly underneath them. You imagine a wide, sweeping beam that catches every single fin moving through the water column. But that is simply not true. Traditional sonar shoots a cone down toward the bottom. The deeper the water gets, the wider that cone becomes. But here is the catch. In shallow water, or even mid-depth water, that cone is surprisingly narrow. If you are sitting in 15 feet of water, the area you are actually seeing on the bottom might only be a circle that is 4 or 5 feet wide. Think about that for a second. You are looking at a massive lake, but your screen is only showing you a tiny little slice of reality right below the transducer. The most active fish, the ones that are cruising around looking for a meal, are not just going to sit perfectly still in that tiny 5-foot circle waiting for your lure. They are roaming, they are aggressive, and more importantly, they are often pushed off to the sides by the pressure wave of your boat. So, You are staring at a completely empty screen, getting frustrated, thinking the bay is completely devoid of life. In reality, the fish are there. They are just swimming 10 feet to the left or 10 feet to the right of your sonar cone. You are fishing completely blind, all while trusting a screen that tells you nobody is home. Now, let us discuss one of the biggest mistakes people make the second they turn their unit on. It is called surface clutter. When you boot up your fish finder, the top layer of the screen is usually filled with a messy, blocky line of static. This happens because the sonar is bouncing off waves, air bubbles, microscopic algae, and the turbulence from your own trolling motor. It looks ugly. It makes the screen hard to read. So, what do 99% of fishermen do? They go into the menu and they crank up the surface clarity filter. They turn on noise rejection. They clean up the screen until the top 10 feet of the water column looks crystal clear and perfectly blue. It looks fantastic to the human eye. It feels clean and organized. But you just committed a massive error. By filtering out all that surface noise, you also filtered out every single fish that is suspended in the top 10 feet of the water. Think about early mornings or cloudy days. Where do the most aggressive predators go to hunt? They push baitfish up to the surface. They use the surface as a wall to trap their prey. By cranking up your filters to make your screen look pretty, you have literally blinded yourself to the exact depth where the most violent and active feeding is taking place. You could have absolute giants swimming 3 feet under the surface, right next to your boat, and your expensive screen will show you absolutely nothing. Moving on from the surface, we need to look at the exact opposite end of the spectrum. I'm talking about the dreaded bottom dead zone. This is a concept that very few everyday anglers actually understand, but it ruins more fishing trips than bad weather. Imagine a steep drop-off, or a large boulder sitting on the bottom of the lake. Your sonar signal travels down and hits the highest point of that rock, or the top edge of that drop-off. The machine immediately registers that highest point as the bottom and draws a hard line on your screen. But what about the area behind the rock? What about the sharp slope underneath that ledge? That area becomes a total shadow. The sonar beam cannot bend around corners. It cannot see through solid objects. So anything that is tucked tightly against the bottom or hiding right behind that boulder completely disappears from your screen. And guess what kind of fish love to hide behind rocks and sit at the base of steep drop-offs? The biggest, meanest ambush predators in the entire lake. They sit in those exact shadows waiting to ambush baitfish. You idle right over them, looking at your top-tier unit. The screen shows a nice rock, but no fish arches. You assume it is empty, and you keep driving. You just drove right past the most active feeding zone because your screen physically cannot display what is hiding in the bottom dead zone. Let us dive into the suspension trick that fish play on us all the time. There is a layer of water in most lakes during the summer called the thermocline. This is where warm surface water meets the cold, dense water from the bottom. Plankton gathers here, baitfish gather to eat the plankton, and the big predators hang around to eat the baitfish. It is a massive underwater buffet. But here is the problem with your fancy electronics. When fish suspend right on the edge of the thermocline, they are often floating completely motionless, waiting for a meal to swim by. Traditional sonar struggles with motionless targets. If a fish is not moving through the cone, it does not create that beautiful, classic arch that we are all trained to look for. Instead, it might just show up as a faint, straight line, or a tiny little smudge that blends perfectly into the clutter of the thermocline itself. Many fishermen look at that smudge and assume it is just interference, floating debris, or thick algae. They totally ignore it. They want to see those giant boomerang shapes on the bottom. So they let their bait sink right past the most active feeding zone, all the way down into the cold, dead water where nothing is biting. They ignore the subtle clues in the middle of the water column because their expensive machine does not make it brutally obvious that those smudges are actually hungry, aggressive fish waiting for a meal. You also have to consider the very real impact of boat noise and physical shadows. Think about the setup of a typical fishing boat. You have a heavy hull, you have a trolling motor spinning in the front, maybe a live well pump humming away, and you are stomping around on the deck. Sound travels incredibly fast and efficiently underwater. Long before your sonar cone ever sweeps over a group of active, feeding fish in shallow or mid-depth water, they have already heard you coming. They feel the pressure wave of the hull displacing the water. They hear the high-pitched whine of the trolling motor prop. What do active fish do when a giant, noisy object approaches them? They move. They do not necessarily swim a mile away, but they slide 10 or 15 feet to the left or right. They move just far enough to get out of the direct path of the boat. And remember what we said earlier about the narrow cone angle of your transducer. Since the fish move just slightly to the side, they are completely out of your sonar beam. You look at your screen, you see absolutely nothing, and you conclude there are no fish in the area. But the reality is that the most active, bite-ready fish are completely surrounding your boat, just outside the view of your screen. Your expensive technology is completely blind to them, simply because your approach pushed them out of the tiny window your machine can actually see. Let us talk about the sensitivity trap that almost every angler falls into at some point. When you buy a high-end unit, it usually comes right out of the box in an automatic mode. The computer inside the machine is constantly trying to guess what you want to see. It adjusts the sensitivity up and down based on depth and water clarity. But sometimes, auto mode makes the screen look like a complete mess, especially if the water is slightly muddy or full of microscopic life. So, you take matters into your own hands. You switch over to manual sensitivity. You start turning the sensitivity down until the screen looks beautiful and clear. The bottom line is sharp. The background is a lovely solid blue or black. It feels great. But you just made a terrible mistake. By turning down the sensitivity to make the picture look pretty, you have drastically reduced the power of the receiver. You are basically telling the machine to ignore weaker signals. And what creates a weak signal? A fish that is sitting on the outer edge of your sonar cone. A fish that is suspended higher up in the water column. Even a massive fish can show up as a weak signal if it is not positioned perfectly dead center under the transducer. You have intentionally commanded your expensive fish finder to ignore the very targets you are trying to find, all for the sake of having a screen that looks like a nice video game instead of reality. I want to share a story about the invisible base. It was a perfectly overcast morning, the kind of day where the air feels heavy and you just know the fish are going to bite. I was fishing a large point that dropped off into deeper water. I idled back and forth over the point for 20 minutes, staring intensely at my screen. The down imaging was on, the traditional sonar was pinging away. I was looking for any sign of life. The screen was completely blank. Not a single arch, not a single bait ball. My brain told me to pick up the trolling motor and move to a different spot. My expensive technology was telling me loudly and clearly that the point was a ghost town. But a sudden gut feeling, maybe just plain old stubbornness, told me to stop and cast anyway. I picked up a deep-diving crankbait and launched it over the point. I cranked it down, bouncing it off the rocks. Boom! The rod nearly got ripped out of my hands. I reeled in a massive, heavy bass. I threw right back to the exact same spot. Boom! Another one. Over the next hour, I caught 15 active, feeding fish off a point that my $2,000 screen swore was empty. Why? Because those fish were tucked so tightly into the crevices of the rocks, waiting to ambush prey, that the sonar signal completely passed over them. The machine lied to me, and if I had listened to it, I would have missed the best day of fishing I had all year. This brings us to the great debate between side imaging and traditional straight-down sonar. Many guys spend a fortune to get side imaging, but then they completely misunderstand how to use it. They keep their eyes glued to the traditional two-dimensional sonar while just occasionally glancing at the side imaging. This is completely backward if you are hunting for active fish. Active fish move. They hunt. They do not sit directly under your boat waiting for a ping. Traditional sonar only tells you history. It tells you what you literally just drove over. By the time you see a beautiful arch on your traditional screen, That fish is already behind your boat. You are casting to a ghost. Side imaging, on the other hand, shows you exactly what is happening 40, 50, or 80 feet to the left and right of your boat right now. It shows you the shadows of fish suspended out in the open water. It shows you the actual hunting grounds where predators are actively chasing bait. If you are ignoring your side imaging, or if you do not know how to read the subtle little grains of rice on that dark screen, you are missing the most important information your unit can give you. You are relying on a narrow, outdated view of the water column, entirely missing the wide feeding zones where the most aggressive and hungry fish are actively doing their damage. Let us talk about frequency mistakes. Your high-dollar fish finder probably has chirp technology, which means it sweeps through a range of frequencies to give you a better picture. But it also lets you choose specific frequencies, like 200 kHz or 83 kHz. Most fishermen have no idea what these numbers actually mean. They just leave it on whatever setting the factory gave them. Here is the simple truth. High frequencies, like 200 kHz, give you incredible detail. They show perfect separation between fish and the bottom, but they have a very narrow cone. Low frequencies, like 83 kHz, give you less detail, but a much wider cone. If you are fishing in shallow water, say less than 20 feet, and you are using a high-frequency setting, your cone is basically the size of a dinner plate. You are scanning absolutely nothing. The active fish are swimming all around you, right under your nose, but your ultra-detailed narrow beam is missing them completely. Conversely, if you use a low frequency in very deep water, the cone gets so massive that a fish could be 60 feet away from your boat, but the screen makes it look like it is directly underneath you. You end up dropping your bait to a depth where the fish simply is not located. Using the wrong frequency is like trying to look through a telescope backward. It totally distorts reality. We need to dive deeper into the thermocline bounce, because it is a phenomenon that fools even the most seasoned tournament pros. As we discussed earlier, the thermocline is a harsh temperature change in the water column. But what you might not know is that a severe temperature change literally changes the density of the water. This density change acts almost like a physical wall for sonar signals. When your ping goes down and hits a strong thermocline, a large portion of that signal actually bounces off the dense water and returns to the transducer, never even reaching the true bottom of the lake. On your screen, this looks like a thick, hazy band running across the middle of the display. But here is the critical part. Because the signal is bouncing off that layer, it is losing an immense amount of power. Anything below that thermocline might be completely invisible to your machine, or show up as incredibly weak marks. But worse than that, the active fish hunting right inside that thick, hazy band get completely masked by the interference. The screen just shows you a wall of clutter. You look at it, get annoyed, and assume it is just dirty water or a glitch. Meanwhile, the most violent feeding frenzy of the day is happening right inside that hazy band. Your machine is showing you exactly where the food chain is most active, but because it looks like static, you ignore it and keep driving. Let us face a harsh reality about shallow water. The shallow water dilemma is something the marketing departments at big marine electronic companies do not want you to think about. If you are fishing in 3 to 5 feet of water, which is often where the most aggressive feeding happens, your $2,000 fish finder is basically a very expensive paperweight. In 3 feet of water, your sonar cone is barely wider than a coffee can. Think about the physics of that. You are moving forward with a trolling motor. A fish is sitting in 3 feet of water. By the time your tiny little coffee can-sized sonar beam reaches that fish, the bow of your boat is literally right on top of its head. The shadow of the boat, the pressure wave, the noise of the trolling motor prop. That fish is gone long before the sonar ever has a chance to ping it. You will stare at your screen all day in the shallows and swear there is not a single living creature in the entire bay. And yet, guys casting spinnerbaits and topwater frogs are catching monster after monster. In shallow water, You have to completely ignore your electronics and trust your eyes. Trust the water flow. Trust the visible cover like lily pads and laydowns. If you rely on your screen in skinny water, you are intentionally blinding yourself to the most obvious and active feeding zones that Mother Nature provides. Now, let us talk about baitfish balls and the hidden predators that lurk inside them. When you are idling around and you see a massive, glorious blob of baitfish on your screen, your heart starts racing. It is exactly what you want to see. A giant school of shad or herring means the predators have to be nearby. But here is where the technology actually works against you. A tightly packed school of thousands of baitfish creates a massive acoustic shadow. The sonar signal hits the top and the sides of that dense bait ball, and it simply cannot penetrate all the way through to the center or the bottom of the school. The screen shows you a giant red or yellow blob, but it cannot show you what is hiding directly underneath it. The biggest, smartest, most active predators do not just swim around the edges. They often sit dead center underneath the bait ball, using the shadows and the chaos to ambush their prey. You look at the screen and you see the bait, but you do not see any large arches around it, so you assume the predators have moved on. You reel up and leave. Meanwhile, there is a giant fish sitting right in the center of that acoustic shadow, actively feeding, waiting for a crippled baitfish to fall. By not understanding how dense bait blocks your sonar signal, you are literally driving away from the most active feeding zone on the whole lake. Another massive error comes down to ping speed and boat speed mismatch. Every fish finder has a setting for ping speed, which is how many times per second the transducer sends a sound wave down into the water. It also has a scroll speed, which is how fast the picture moves across your screen from right to left. If you are idling around the lake at 5 or 6 miles per hour looking for active fish, but your ping speed is set too low, you are getting a terribly distorted picture of reality. Because the boat is moving fast and the pings are far apart, a large fish will only get hit by the sonar beam 1 or 2 times. Instead of a beautiful thick arch that screams active fish, it just shows up as a tiny little dot or a flat line. You glance at the screen, see a couple of tiny dots, assume they are just small bait or floating debris, and you keep driving. You just drove over the exact depth where the biggest fish in the lake were holding. You have to match your scroll speed and ping speed to the speed of your boat. If you are scanning fast, everything needs to be turned up. If you do not adjust this, your screen is essentially lying to you through compression. It shrinks massive, hungry fish down into insignificant little pixels that your brain is trained to completely ignore. Let us look at a purely physical mistake that throws off thousands of anglers every single day. I'm talking about the angle of the transducer on the back of your boat. Most guys screw it into the transom, make it look roughly parallel to the ground while the boat is on the trailer, and never think about it again. But boats do not sit perfectly flat in the water. When you are idling at 3 miles per hour, the bow of your boat lifts up slightly, and the back of your boat pushes down. This means your transducer is no longer pointing straight down at the center of the earth. It is pointing slightly backward. This changes the entire geometry of what you are looking at. If a fish is suspended 20 feet deep, but your cone is shooting out at an angle behind the boat, the screen is going to calculate that fish at a different depth. It might show that fish at 25 feet. So, you drop your bait down to 25 feet, trying to get it right in front of the active feeder. But your bait is 5 feet beneath the fish. The fish never even sees it. You sit there frustrated, thinking the fish are just inactive and refuse to bite. The fish is incredibly active. It is just holding at a completely different depth than what your misaligned screen is telling you. A tiny tilt on the back of your boat translates to a massive error in the water column. There is a widespread obsession in the fishing world with the bottom. We are absolutely obsessed with finding structure. We look for rock piles, we look for sunken timber, we look for roadbeds. We spend hours staring at the bottom inch of our fish finder screens. Because of this obsession, we are completely ignoring the middle column of the water. There is a whole category of fish called pelagic feeders. These are fish that do not care about the bottom at all. They spend their entire lives suspended in the open water, roaming in wolf packs, hunting down schools of bait. Because we are so focused on reading every single rock and bump on the bottom, we totally tune out the middle of the screen. I have seen guys idle right through a massive school of actively feeding hybrid stripers or spotted bass suspended at 15 feet over 50 feet of water. They drive right through them, staring at the bottom, complaining that the structure looks empty today. They are entirely blind to the chaos and feeding frenzy happening halfway up the water column. If you only look at the bottom, your expensive machine is just drawing you a very pretty topographical map. You have to force your eyes to scan the dead space in the middle of the screen. That empty blue space is very often the exact depth where the most violent and active feeding is taking place. Let us discuss the transition zone, the area where two different types of bottom meet. This is where mud turns into gravel, or where sand meets large boulders. Transition zones are absolute magnets for active fish, but they confuse the absolute life out of your sonar. The transducer sends a signal down, and it bounces back. Hard bottoms return a strong signal, making a thick line on your screen. Soft, muddy bottoms absorb the signal, making a thin, faint line. When you idle over a transition zone, the machine is rapidly trying to adjust between these two extreme signals. The automatic sensitivity goes crazy. The bottom line on your screen gets jagged, blurry, and filled with false returns. It looks like a messy glitch. So what happens? An active predator is sitting right on that transition line, blending perfectly into the messy sonar return. The machine simply cannot separate the fish from the confused bottom signal. You look at your screen, you see a blurry, messy bottom, and you assume there are no fish there. You completely miss the fact that the most aggressive ambush predators use these exact messy zones to camouflage themselves. By trusting the clarity of your screen over your knowledge of fish behavior, you are ignoring the exact depth and location where the best action of the day is waiting for you. I want to give you a real-world example that will drive this point home. A few years ago, I was fishing a tournament with a buddy of mine. I was running the front of the boat using my massive, high-definition screens, networking 2 units together. I was scanning everything. I had the side imaging dialed in, the down imaging perfectly tuned. I was proudly fishing exactly where the screens told me the fish were holding, and I was catching absolutely nothing. My buddy in the back of the boat was using a tiny, ancient black and white flasher unit that he kept mounted on a portable bracket. It looked like something from 30 years ago. He was dropping a simple jig down, watching the little blinking light on his primitive dial. He proceeded to catch his limit in 1 hour. He was pulling active fish right out from under the boat. I was furious. I asked him what he was seeing that I was missing. He said the fish was suspended just above a thick layer of grass. My super advanced unit was blending the fish into the top of the grass layer, making them invisible on my high-tech screen. His cheap little flasher, with its raw, unfiltered signal, showed a tiny flicker of movement just above the weeds. He ignored the pretty picture and focused on the raw data. He found the exact depth of the active feeders, while my expensive screen completely ignored them. This is why adjusting your mindset is the single most important thing you can do on the water. You have to stop treating your fish finder screen like it is a live video feed of reality. It is not a television. It is a tool that interprets echoes. It is making mathematical guesses based on sound waves bouncing off things in the dark. It is a piece of the puzzle, not the entire picture. When you rely 100% on what the screen tells you, you turn your brain off. You stop looking at the wind direction. You stop looking at the current. You stop noticing the baitfish flickering on the surface 50 yards away. You become a zombie, staring at a glowing rectangle. The best fishermen in the world use their electronics to find the structure and the general depth of the bait, but then they let the fish tell them the rest of the story. If your screen says the fish are on the bottom, but you are not getting bites, you have to be willing to ignore the machine and fish higher up in the water column. You have to be willing to accept that the machine might be missing the most active fish due to shadows, cone angles, or user error. The moment you start questioning your screen is the moment you actually start becoming a better, more instinctual angler. So what are the actionable steps you can take on the water today to fix this? First, turn off the automatic sensitivity. Take control of your machine. Go into manual mode and adjust the sensitivity until you can actually see the faint smudges in the middle of the water column, even if it makes the screen a little messy. Second, turn down your surface clutter filters. Deal with a little bit of noise at the top of your screen so you do not miss the massive predators hunting just a few feet under the surface. Third, stop relying entirely on two-dimensional downscanning. Spend the time to learn how to read side imaging. Look for the shadows cast by fish out in the open water, far away from the noise of your boat. And finally, trust your instincts. If a spot looks perfect, if the wind is blowing directly into a rocky point, if you can feel that the conditions are right, fish it. Fish it hard, even if your $2,000 screen tells you it is completely empty. Cast into the shallows, cast into the transition zones, and experiment with your depth. Remember that the most active, hungry fish are often doing things that electronics struggle to translate. Break the habit of fishing for pixels and start fishing for actual fish again. To wrap all of this up, the most game-changing realization you can have as an angler is that your fish finder is literally designed to miss things. Between the narrow cone angles in shallow water, the acoustic shadows of rocks and bait balls, the surface clutter filters, and the physical angle of your boat, there are massive chunks of the water column that your screen will never show you. The biggest plot twist is that these hidden zones, the thermocline edges, the shallow flats, and the heavy transition areas, are the exact places where the most active, feeding fish spend their time. When you finally understand this, your entire approach to fishing changes. You stop being a slave to the screen and you start being a true predator again. You use the electronics to find the playing field, but you use your brain to actually play the game. Thank you so much for watching and hanging out with me today. If this video changed the way you look at your electronics, hit that subscribe button, leave a like, and drop a comment below. I want to know, what is the biggest fish you ever caught when your screen was completely blank? Let us start a debate down there, and I will see you on the water next time.